This week's lecture is done by a very good friend of mine, Dr. J.B. Sachs, Dr. Rabbi J.B. Sachs. Dr. Sachs is currently a co-director of Jewish life at the New Jewish Community High School, De Toledo Jewish High School. I will mess that. I have a whole year to mess that up before we can. He's also a faculty member there, but more importantly, at least for tonight's conversation, he not only has one PhD, but he is completing a second PhD, both at the Claremont schools, one at the Claremont School of Theology and the other one at the Claremont School of Claremont Graduate University. And his PhD is in biblical literature. He's a biblical scholar. He lectures around the city in addition to being on faculty at De Toledo High School. And he lectures mostly on the Tanakh, on the Bible, and in terms of varying perspectives from history to its literary function to its theological messages. And tonight, Dr. Rabbi J.B. Sachs joins us as he will talk to us about what he sees as one of the central and core messages of the God of the Bible. And hopefully he'll explain a little bit more about what that means as we get to know God through the Bible. So without further ado, let's have a warm VBS welcome for Rabbi Dr. J.B. Sachs.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, Rabbi Farkas, and thank you all for being here. And it's so nice to be back at college. It's been a while, but I love a college campus, so I'm happy to be here at this college. It's nice to see a lot of friends and people who I adore and people I've known for a while and people who I've studied with. If it's my mother calling, please tell her I'll call her. I will. I've taught Melton here, and I've been here. We just finished a class with the 4 o'clock scholars. That was 6 sessions that ended yesterday, and what a fantastic group of people to learn with and study with. I was really proud of that, and a little bit of what I'm doing may overlap with things that I've said because I've been thinking a lot about this, and it's not an easy task, really, to actually talk about the God of the Tanakh, because that presumes the Tanakh is one thing, and it is absolutely not one thing. The Tanakh has many books that were not all written or gathered or edited or put together at the same time. The final written approved version of the Torah text was not really even finalized until around the 9th century or so CE, and other books, and was in a lot of fluidity before then, and even the order of the books has not remained constant, whether we're talking about in the prophets or in Ketuvim, the writings. So it's taken a while for our Tanakh to take shape. It's for each of the books to be written and finalized and then to be ordered. And there is so many different writings from different kinds of people, from different time frames, that, as you can imagine, they don't always say the same thing. And as we actually saw today, yesterday in class, when we actually were looking at the laws of Exodus and the laws of Deuteronomy, they actually contradict each other or were clearly written from very different ideological perspectives, and to say the least. What I've been thinking about, though, lately, when I've been thinking about the God of Tanakh, that already is going to be a different God than the God of Torah. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit right now and see if I can make it clear. We've been very Torah-centric. That may be a good thing. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but we've been very, very Torah-centric. We read a portion of the Torah on Saturday afternoons and Monday and Thursday mornings, and then we read a larger one on Saturday morning itself. So 4 times a week we're reading from a Torah scroll. And in most synagogues, they no longer read from a Haftorah scroll or a Nevi'im scroll. I've been to a couple of communities that still do that, but they're very few and far between. We don't have Gabayim for a reading of the Haftarah, like people who would correct the reading or help the reader stay on track as we do with them, with the Torah reading. And the Torah, the core of the Torah, is the book of Leviticus. It is a book that, as the name implies, is largely a book of Levitical priestly concerns. It's very appropriate that a book that contains a lot of priestly concerns is the core of the Torah. Because after all, we're commanded to be, in Exodus, a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. We're supposed to be a priestly community and a holy people. So the way of framing that is putting in the core, in the very center of a Torah, a legislation about how to be priestly, how to be Levitical, and all the concerns they have, so that we might extrapolate from that what it then means for us as Jews to be holy and to be a priestly community, may make some sense. And it is true that Leviticus has more than strictly ritual kinds of concerns. We do have phrases like V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your fellow, love your neighbor as yourself. And there are some other lovely things there, and the laws do admit of a wide variety of themes. But by and large, when you read Leviticus, you're reading many chapters in the beginning of sacrifices, and then later on other kinds of Levitical or priestly kinds of concerns. That's very different when you're reading the Tanakh from cover to cover. The core of Tanakh is not that, but Nevi'im, the prophets. And while the prophets do not all speak with one voice, their major thrust for all of them is not Levitical purity or exactitude in ritual matters. That is not the major or even one of the top priorities. And what I'm going to contend is there are 3 major priorities of the prophets, and then we're going to maybe, hopefully, look into Amos, to a very, very interesting text in chapters 1 and 2. We're not going to be able to study it fully, but I want to look at a certain pieces of that chapter that might give you some way to understand the way I'm framing my understanding of the God of Tanakh through the core of Tanakh, which is prophets. So what does this God want? And my contention is threefold. That the God of Tanakh is concerned with 3 things, not necessarily in this order all the time, and not always focused on all 3 things at once. But one is idolatry, one is morality, and one is concern for others. And the way I understand idolatry is it is about having an authentic faith. We all want to be real, and we all want to have a spirituality that feels authentic to us. And to me, the essence of idolatry is that the starting point of a Jewish faith is not non-Jewish faith. That is not to be negative about other faiths. I think that all true religions promote very good things. They promote honesty, and they promote integrity, and they promote good relationships. But an authentic spirituality is one whose starting point is not a foreign kind of spirituality, that emerges out of a different kind of culture or sociological milieu. It needs to be one that emerges from a real struggle with Jewishness and Jewish God ideas and Jewish history and Jewish destiny. The second concern, morality, I think is really an issue of integrity. It is about really being the best you can be at all times, which is really impossible because we're all human and we don't always live up to the best of ourselves, and we don't always say the right thing at the right time. But the goal of morals and ethics is to get us to try to do that. That takes practice, and it takes thoughtfulness, and it takes concentration, and it takes will. But that, to me, is the concern of a moral code. And then finally, the concern for others is a concern for social justice. That for Jews, the Jewish God is a God that wants you to care about other people. Other people doesn't just mean your children and grandchildren, though I hope you care about them, but it means caring for people who you may not know. And the Jewish God is especially concerned about caring for people who don't really have a voice and for whom there is no one who is usually or readily speaking up, or when that person or persons do speak up, their voices don't get heard. That we need to hear for those who are least able to be heard in society. And so, I want with that maybe to look at Amos, to spell this out a little bit more fully by studying it with you. Before I do that, it's actually, I didn't pick the text with this in mind, but I would like to say that it is not inappropriate. It is very appropriate that we're looking at this week in light of events that occurred in Paris and have continued to occur in various parts of the world with acts of terror. The God in Amos emerges from a sense of holy war that is throughout much of the Hebrew Bible. We actually looked at some passages a couple of weeks ago in the 4 o'clock scholars class when the day was spent on talking about what does the Tanakh tell us about relationships, might offer us on relationships between Jews and non-Jews. And while there are definitely some wonderful passages, we also found that there are some passages that were troubling to us, because when God commands us to take over the promised land, and when Joshua enters, it's not an empty land. There are actually many peoples there. There are Girgashites and Perizzites and Hivites and Ammonites and Amorites, and depending on the list, there's the lists differ every time you see the list of native peoples, but there's plenty of native peoples already living there. And the text asks us to go in and not just inhabit the land, but to destroy native cultures and the people, including infants. And it's very, very difficult reading. And we talked about how is it that some people look at passages that are difficult and think that that's what they're supposed to do, and while how others look at those passages and say, that is not what God wants me to do. And what I'm also hoping we'll see, while the God of Amos emerges out of that, we'll see that the reason why the God emerges out of that is that God, it gets very upset most often when people aren't concerned about the deep issues of social concern, especially. And so I'd like to, with that, start to look into Amos with you, so we can study it together. Amos, it does not actually matter all that much, but Amos lived in the 8th century BCE, somewhere around 760-ish BCE. And in this first 2 chapters, he has a very rhetorically powerful speech. He has gathered a group of Israelites around, and he gets them very fired up. And he does that, as we'll see, actually by talking about a neighboring country of the Israelites, and saying how God is going to get them. And you can almost hear the crowd saying, yeah, those enemies, get them, they're horrible, terrible. And then he goes to another enemy and another enemy and another enemy. And then all of a sudden, when he gets to the 7th group of people, it's already Judah. But Judah is sort of a vassal state of Israel at this time. And the northerners don't like the southerners, and the southerners don't like the northerners. And so you can actually still hear that the Israelites would be cheering when God is going to destroy the brothers and sisters of the northerners, those who live in the south, in a country called Judah, and say that they're going to get it. And as the crowd is roaring because God is going to destroy everyone around them, and they'll get to be alone in the world to rule everything, but no one to rule over, apparently, then God gives a final 8th oracle, which is directed against the Israelites. And that is the longest of these speeches. In each of these speeches, and as you can see the way I laid it out regarding Aram, regarding Philistia, regarding Tyre, which is Phoenicia, regarding the country of Edom, etc. With each of those, the poet has a very clear formula. Thus declares Hashem, and then it will say, for 3 transgressions X of some country, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment. It sort of feels like he's saying, you do some things wrong, I can tolerate it. But when you get to certain kinds of wrongdoings, I will no longer tolerate it, and I will act. Because I, God, cannot tolerate the way you have taken my charge to live in the world and corrupted it in ways that are awful. By also framing it in that way, it suggests that this is not something that happens once, but by saying for 3 but not 4, it sort of suggests that this is happening a lot of these bad occurrences over and over again. And what I want to focus on as we go through is really what is highlighted as the essential terrible sin of the community at large. And we will look at all of them. And before we do that, it is quite probable, by the way, that when Amos was telling this, there was actually no military threat to Israel whatsoever. They were living in a time seemingly of prosperity and peace. So it's very interesting that even in a time of peace and prosperity, a charge to go get the other, somebody who's different, and get rid of them is somehow might get a crowd riled up and fired up. It is also the case that it's very interesting that in Amos, and you'll find this in Tanakh, particularly in prophets, that the God of Israel is also the God of non-Jews. And it does not seem necessarily that God cares for one all the time necessarily more than the other. In fact, in the prophets, it even says God is depicted as saying, Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, Israel, my heritage. That's from Isaiah, but that is sort of a common kind of motif where God is being presented as a God who cares equally about all human beings because they're all God's creatures, and while different kinds of cultures come up with different kinds of faith commitments, God seems to care for all of them, but doesn't always care for the actions of the community. That is actually, you could think of that as being based on Exodus, right? God doesn't, God looks at Pharaoh, and the problem with Pharaoh isn't that there shouldn't be an Egypt or that Jews should live in Egypt. God doesn't want us living there at all. The problem with Pharaoh is that Pharaoh oppresses. When it gives laws in the book, in the Torah, it sometimes gives motive clauses. Why should you do it? Sometimes live a long life, for good fortune, whatever. But there is a very unusual motive clause when it comes to Pharaoh. It appears only once. And that motive clause is in Exodus 22, where if you don't help the ger, the resident alien, the documented or undocumented worker who lives near you or in your community, as well as widows and orphans, then I, God, will come to take care of them by doing something to you, because those people matter to me. So now let's look inside Amos. And we're going to be looking for what the major sin is. So Hashem's first declaration comes with regarding Aram. Does everybody see where it says regarding Aram? Yeah, it's about the 7th, 8th line. We're not going to have time to study every single word. By the way, as we study together, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll try to, if it sort of helps promote our discussion in some way or helps clarify the text or something like that, I'll be happy to try to answer it if I can. But if it's something that's really, it mentions King Uzziah, who is he married to, and did they have a good recipe for cholent, I'm not probably going to answer those kinds of questions. Okay, so let's look. Regarding Aram, thus declares Hashem, for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4, I will not revoke. In the Hebrew it says, Lo ashivenu, I will not revoke it, but it means I won't revoke the punishment. I will proceed with punishing you. And what is the thing that is terrible? Because they have threshed Gilead, with threshing boards of iron. What does anybody have a thought of what that might actually mean? Threshed Gilead with threshing boards of iron. What? You skin them, yes. They're actually like wooden boards that have iron things on them so you could torture them. It's not just enough to fight in battle or to arrest somebody and perhaps incarcerate them. Apparently, these Arameans actually tortured people, and torture is not how you treat people according to the God of the prophets. Even people that you don't like. By the way, because this is against Aram, you might think that what Aram did was something horrible to either Israel or Judah. Must have been to the Jews. That may or may not be the case. For Amos, certainly if it is something he's referring to that has something about Jews, it must have occurred in a fairly distant past from when he is living. Gilead is not necessarily a Jewish area. It is on the east side of the Jordan. It was the half a tribe of Manasseh and one of the tribes that will come to me lived in that area long before this, but actually it is located between Aram and Ammon, and actually the Arameans and Ammonites were often picking on Gilad as a strategic position between the two. So it's interesting, the very first one, that the prophet is riling up the crowd, go get these bad people. They might have known that they did bad things, but they weren't necessarily even doing them to the Jews. And yet God is very concerned that such things like torture, that there is nothing that warrants that. There is absolutely no reason for the God of the prophets to actually be taking wooden boards with metal spikes and flaying people's skin off of them. So that is the sin with Aram. Let's look now at where it says regarding Philistia. And through the repetition of the sort of prophetic judgment formula that always begins, thus declares Hashem, so it's not the prophet's desire, it's what is God says, continues. For 3 transgressions of Gaza, they were in the news back then, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. And what is the thing that they shouldn't do? Because they carried into exile entire communities to hand them over to Edom. So I don't know if that's meant, it seems like it's meant as 2 things. One is that they actually displaced peoples that were native to the areas where Edomites ruled. That was actually not uncommonly done in ancient times for a variety of reasons. And not only that, they hand them over to Edom, and the country of Edom was noted for slavery and certain kinds of treatment of non-Edomite populations living in their midst. And it's interesting because in these oracles, we're not actually going to be exploring them a whole lot, but very often God fights fire with fire, and so each time the punishment begins, so I will send a fire, very interestingly. But Gaza was a main city of the Philistines. Ashdod and Ashkelon and Ekron are mentioned. There were 4 major cities of the Philistines. The 5th one was Gat. At this time in history, though, it is probable that Gat was already subsumed by Ashdod and was fallen under, sort of became part of greater Ashdod. And so it mentions the 4 cities of the Philistines who literally displaced peoples in an unwarranted way, and not only displaced them, but handed them over for even poorer treatment than they would have done had they remained. Question?
I don't quite understand the numbering.
I didn't hear the word, the what?
The numbering.
The numbering 3, 4?
Well, it's clear about 1, 2, and 3. And then it makes a statement for the 4th that I will not punish them. I don't understand how you get there. How is...
For 3 transgressions of Gaza and for 4, how we get to the 4th?
What is it? It seems like you have 3 transgressions.
Yeah.
And then you have a 4th that he says he's not going to punish them.
Yeah, I think the 3, 4 is more of a literary device. I don't think it's meant to be literal. I think by doing it, by having 3, 4, it just sort of gets in the mindset that people sin, and some sins God can tolerate, and there are some sins that get not. So when it says 3 sins, for some minor things, I might overlook it. I, God, not I, me, but I, God, will overlook it. But there comes to be a point if you commit a certain kind of sin, that will be something I can't overlook. So I think it's more formulaic than literal. And so that's why they only mention 1 sin, even though they've already said for 3 or 4, they only mention 1. The 1 sin that is the coup de grace of horrible action that a particular community is designated to have. And truthfully, for the point of the audience, it doesn't even matter to what degree it is entirely true or it is a memory that all of them would know about. The idea that these things are bad things are things that would have resonated very clearly. And though I do believe that, I think we have great reason to believe that pretty much all the book of Amos is original to the prophet, and that he was very careful in crafting a message that his audience would buy into, and it rises in power as we go. So thank you for the question. I hope that helps, but it's actually not meant to be a literal 3 to 4. It's just meant to say, I can tolerate little things, but it comes to a certain point, if you commit big thing, I'm not even going to let one of them go by, kind of thing. Okay? We go next to Tyre to look at that sin. And once we get to the end, we'll put all the sins together and try to unpack what they are. So again, with Tyre, which is Phoenicia, and Phoenicia actually had very friendly relationships with Israel all the time. Solomon made a covenant, a brit, with Hiram. Some of the materials for the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, came from Phoenicia. And I don't know of a single time in biblical literature where actually Phoenicia doesn't get along. So it's interesting that Phoenicia is put here, but they are one of the neighboring tribes. And what is happened with Phoenicia is on the sea. And that was their major industry, and their major source of power is that they controlled the sea lanes. That's very important because the sin here is because they delivered entire communities over to Edom and ignored the covenant of kinship. So how did they deliver people to Edom? By ships. They were slaves. They were involved in the slave trade. They were doing human trafficking, and human trafficking, slavery is not something, and that would have been something that, even though it didn't necessarily affect Israel, would have been something that would have been abhorrent to the God of Israel and would have been something that Amos's audience knew about. So when it comes to Phoenicia, human trafficking. Yeah, they reached it through the ships went to where Eilat is. There was a port in Eilat even in that day. And that's oftentimes where they went, and then it's not a long distance to Edom, which actually stretched down to that area at various points in ancient times. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Please.
It deals with the translation because it says each time it says for 3 transgressions and for 4. Is that an accurate translation?
Yeah, it's pretty literal. Yes.
It's very strange.
If you read the prophets, it gets stranger. A lot of prophecies are just very difficult Hebrew, but the sense of it is, but that is the sense of the numbers. But I'd rather not focus on the 3-4 as a literary device and how that works, and more on the actual sins, because that's what God cares about. So we move over to Edom on the next sheet. And Edom, the transgression there is because he pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity. He maintained his anger perpetually and a storm unchecked. Who is the brother of the Edomites? Does anybody know? I can't hear. Israelites, absolutely, right? Edom's ancestor was Esau, right? And Mount Seir is part of Edom, and Israel was named for Jacob, and so Jacob is the ancestor of the Israelites, and Esau of Edom. So when it says they went after their brother, he's actually talking to the crowd and getting them where it really hits home. And this is now the 4th, though it's sort of in the middle of the oration. So not only is Edom an enemy, he's reminding them that they have actually had a lot of battles with Edom, and that Edom does things without pity. And we already know that because Edom takes in slaves and displaced population and maltreats them, because that was the source of two other the Philistines and the Phoenicians. Now we go to Ammon, and here the sin in the next sin is because they have ripped open pregnant women in Gilead in order to enlarge their territory. So here you're not only attacking the people, you're attacking the next generation of that culture by killing off children or pregnant women. It is a real intense hatred that would enable somebody to actually kill a pregnant woman. This not only happened in biblical times, in the Chmielnicki massacres against Jews in the 17th century in 1648, we actually have eyewitness accounts of those. And the same thing actually happened by the Cossacks to the Jews, where pregnant women were ripped open. And I actually won't go farther because it actually doesn't get better, the descriptions of the eyewitness accounts. So these things actually were not hyperbolic. They were actually things that happened that people could treat people so casually. We go to Moab, the next one. And because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom. So here, not only would the Moabites fight another country, but they would go to do some tomb desecration, and they would take the bones of the king and burn them so that they would become plaster to be used in building. Unthinkable until the Shoah. Unthinkable, but apparently happened. And again, offense of non-Jew to non-Jew, and yet something we are to care about because the God of Nevi'im cares about it. Regarding Judah, it is the first time that the sin here is not even about a war crime. And I don't know if the crowd would have noticed or not, because the crowd would have been getting riled up. Yay, you're getting them, God. Yay, thank you. That's a great message, Amos. God's going to get this neighbor and that neighbor. And now he's going to get Judah, and those southerners, I don't like them anyway. So for 3 transgressions and 4, and what did the Judahites, those Jews living in Judah, do? Because they have rejected Hashem's teaching and have not kept divine laws, but they have been led astray by the same delusions after which their ancestors walked. Led astray usually indicates idolatry, that they weren't, the reason why they rejected Hashem's teachings and divine laws is they felt that spirituality would be better found with other kinds of spiritual pursuits. Phoenician gods, whatever other gods they might have encountered. Hittite gods, etc. Sometimes archaeologists, when they have uncovered certain settlements, have actually found what appear to be icons of foreign gods in Jewish settlements. So these things probably were not just hyperbole, but also actually happened. It is also the case that, very interestingly, that while it's saying it about Judah, there were periods of time, even in the century where Amos lived, where the religion of the Jews in Israel was very different than the religion of Judah. And of course, each side claimed it had the correct version of Judaism. Neither one would go daven in the other's shuls. Unlike today, where we all are kumbaya, the Jewish people. So, God is even going to send a fire to Judah. And now let's go to the final one of Israel, and then we'll try to put it all together. The transgression about Israel is also, just like there's 8 oracles, there's actually 8 things they do wrong. And these are his actual audience in front of him. So while he's got them riled up, now he's going to turn the tables on them. Because they sell for silver those whose cause is just, that is, the innocent, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Imagine that a person isn't worth a pair of sandals. That is suggesting that they not just treated them badly, but treated that human life as being not human life, as being not worth their lives. This is the profligate lifestyle of the wealthy and the arrogant wealthy. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go into the same girl. Ve'ezmir. Ve'ezmir is not in the Hebrew. So that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines they imposed. That is, there's plenty to say there, but they don't have the system of law is not really a system of law that it works for everyone. That there is such a lack of personal integrity that a father and a son could take the same probably slave girl, possibly go to the same house of ill repute, but be with the same woman at the same time. That garments taken in pledge, we actually read yesterday, you're actually supposed to return them before sundown because poor people need that garment to keep warm at night. So even if you're a creditor and you have a garment unpledged until they pay you, you actually have to return the garment every night. We read that both in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And here in the society of Amos, they're not only not returning it, but they're actually wearing it for themselves and showing off how they've taken somebody else's property and used it, and no one, even in the temple, will do anything to them. They can get away with it because, after all, the garment they took is of a nobody. Yes?
Are Israel's transgressions against other Jews?
Yes. Yes, these are the transgressions that Jews did against Jews. I know it's hard to believe that any Jew would do anything to a Jew.
But would similar actions against non-Jews also fall into this category?
Yes, absolutely. Because we already saw how actions of non-Jews against non-Jews that are heinous, are not looked good by the God of the prophets. And they even drink wine in the house of God when it is not Purim. And they couldn't have been Purim because there was no Purim yet. Right? The story is about something that probably happened, to whatever degree the history behind Esther is 400 years or at least later. Okay, so when you look at these sins as a whole and categorize them, you have a number of different things. There isn't a lot about idolatry because most of the oracles are about other communities. They're not all about them. But they do talk about people, when they get to Judah and Israel, about people going astray or not having an authentic worship, even for those who consider themselves pious and go to shul. Not everybody is in shul for the right reason on the right day or on any day. But idolatry is about authentic faith. And that is not something that can be defined, because it's not about how punctilious you are in lighting the Hanukkah candles correctly. Did you do them right to left to right? Did we forget? Whatever and whatever. And if you made sure you did it right and made sure the spacing from each one was exact and blah blah blah, that isn't what authentic faith is about. That's what halakha might be about, and halakha, though, as a guide to help us. And helping us light the Hanukkah candles maybe can get us to a place once they're lit and we can reflect on them as we're supposed to do. But being halakhically focused is not faith, at least not by itself, and is not the main part of a spirituality necessarily. It's a part of spirituality, but it's not all of spirituality. Spirituality isn't rule following for the sake of rule following. Spirituality, we all know, has to be something deeper that's in here, not by what somebody can see us do there. So that's one piece. The second piece of the personal integrity is clearly what God is concerned about, especially with us. That you don't take other people's clothing as a pledge when you know they need it to sleep in. You don't use it. You don't go to shul in it. You don't bask in it publicly. You don't have sexual intercourse with people you shouldn't have and then include your children in it, in a orgiastic thing. And most especially, in every single one of these, there is social concern. That if you, the God of Israel, more so than punctiliousness and halakha, is concerned about how you treat other people, and most especially the people that are outside of your orbit of friendships and synagogue relationships. They are about how you treat the poor, how you treat the needy, how you treat slaves or whoever represents them, how you treat resident aliens, documented and undocumented workers who live among you, how you treat widows and orphans and other people who don't have a level playing field for them. They are not about having traps to fine certain people so that you can go get drunk, which is the last one. Having your police officers or other people try to find tricks to incarcerate or fine people. And so the God I see of the prophets is not the God of Leviticus, because the God of Leviticus is mostly focused on rules of sacrifice and other kinds of priestly concerns. And as good as those would be, if you only read the Torah, you would be concerned about, gosh, they skipped Ashrei, how horrible. What kind of rabbi is that allows such a thing? They didn't use the right melody, whatever that is, for Adon Olam. How horrible. What kind of cantor is she or he? That's what your concern would be if you read Leviticus. But the rabbis decided to say they couldn't take away a Torah reading that had been instituted by Ezra, but they could correct it by insisting that you hear the prophetic voice each and every week, insisted that there'd be a Haftorah that may or may not be related to the Torah portion, and probably at least 35% of them really don't have any obvious relationship to it, because they don't want you to be left with what might be a portion that is focused on details and exterior actions of ritual. But the God of the prophets, the God of what has become our sacred literature, is a God who wants you to care not about how you pray, but why you pray and what you get out of prayer. And a God who cares not about if you're in shul, but how you show integrity. And that what you got out of shul was to lead a life that is not only deeper spiritually, but has more integrity laced into it. And that is not only about being in shul, but is what you're going to do to show your concern for those who most need your help now. So I'm going to leave you with that for our break, and then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. Yes? Yes? Okay. Great.
So the God of Amos, at least, Amos is an interesting book because it's only 9 chapters long, right? And yet it is packed full of material. We read 2 different Haftarot from Amos and only 9 chapters, which is really interesting to think about because Isaiah is 60-odd chapters long, and we only read about 6 or 7 Haftarot from Isaiah. So Amos is rich with material enough that the rabbis look to Amos for some of the reasons you said earlier.
One of the Haftorahs is technically not enough verses to be really kosher, but that's what
it's Kedoshim, right? Isn't it? Into the mic, they say. Into the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because the Sephardim also read a different... Anyway, so...
Yes.
Okay, so Amos is this prophet who comes from the south, and he goes to the north. So all the prophecies were in the north. And he was, we were just talking, we're trying to figure out who he was as a person. Was he a schlepper who got sort of wind the divine spirit and the word came to him and he saw the north? Does he have a southern mentality and he wasn't used to the opulence of the north and maybe that's what was motivating him? Or was he something else? Was he a successful businessman first in his first career and then decided to go back to the community and use his power of rhetoric to bring truth to power, as they said? So what kind of person do you think Amos was, not including the 15 years that he was actually preaching?
Yeah. So that's actually a tough question to answer, more than it is in other prophets where you actually have at least more narrative material along with the prophecy, so you get a better sense with other prophets of some of their family life or some of the life that they lived and things like that. But you don't really have any narrative material, really. I mean, a sentence that he, of him being a sheep breeder and sycamore, right, figs and things like that. There are very little detail. So you have to tease it out or guess. And it really is going to be just a guess, a guesstimate more than it will be that we know it. And I do think that because Judah did not have the opulence, and in some ways was almost subservient to Israel, that him having gotten wealth in the south was different than being part of a wealthy class that was in the north. There wasn't really a wealthy class in the south. And I think that when we had talked and you had mentioned it, I think there is a sense that he may well have been felt abhorrent toward what he found in the north. It feels like his being a prophet was a calling and not a profession. There actually were professional prophets who did not seem to necessarily be called, but were part of schools, and they went to the University of Prophecy or something, and worked at temples and other places where there actually were prophets. And sometimes the prophets that we have names for raged against the government prophets and the official prophets. So he seems to have had a calling.
But he even says, "Ani lo navi v'lo ben navi." When
Yes.
he's asked by the priest, I think.
But that may well be that he doesn't want to be associated with official
Right.
prophecydom. His passion for social justice is so clear and unwavering and exacting, more so maybe than others that maybe have a lot of other stuff to them, that it either feels that either he or people he knew may have been victimized in some way. I think that he also may have felt that as a wealthy person that not only was he felt abhorrent, but he probably had a lot of questioning about himself, because it almost feels that the kind of anger he feels at the lack of justice and proper treatment of others, that in some way, just even being another wealthy person and maybe part of a chamber of commerce, somehow maybe he felt a little tainted or something, or embarrassed or hurt or overly angry, but it was personal anger, and that can be, mixed in with the righteous anger of it's just wrong.
Okay. So I'm thinking about Amos right now as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's talk about Amos as a vessel for the divine word, because that is the conceit of the book, right? That the prophet is the vessel for God's mouthpiece in the world. And his central messages, as you pointed out, are a quest for authentic faith, as a sort of calling out idolatry and other forms of inauthentic faith, personal integrity, that you should walk the walk, your inside should be like your outside, and that you should live by a code of ethics. And then in addition to that, ultimate concern and sympathy or empathy for those who live at a different station than you do, and that you should put them on a pedestal or them in front of your eyes, and that leads to the much deeper questions of social justice and
I would
social-
say not merely empathy, but empathic action. That it's an empathy that leads to action to do something about it, not just, I feel terrible that there is this injustice going on towards those people, but I think that he's concerned that we don't do just that, but our empathy actually compel us to actually write our congressperson or whatever it is that we do that might possibly make some sort of difference. But he doesn't want us just to feel badly and sit around.
Right. I think, right, exactly. As we were talking, I don't think a charity ball would be sufficient for him
Correct.
for raising money for a charity through a gala or something would not be sufficient for him as a way of changing the power dynamic, which is ultimately what I think he wants to do
Yes.
between the rich and the poor.
Yeah.
Right. So here's the question about this. There are more books. You could even argue there are more chapters in the Tanakh devoted to the prophetic message than any other section of the Tanakh. And that makes sense, right? Because, as you said, the Tanakh was really codified hundreds of years into the Common Era. Mm-hmm. And so you have to ask, who is the audience for the Tanakh? What is the philosophy and who is it written for? And it's written for a community in exile. Mm-hmm. And so therefore they have to ask the simple questions, which are, how did we get here? Where did we go wrong? And what does God want from us so that we can go back? And the prophets answer all of those questions. And then they need prequels in order to get there, right? That's where the Torah comes in some way. But here's a question, right? So if the prophets are so central to the Tanakh, and Amos and other prophets all about authentic faith, personal integrity, social justice, there's only one prophet in the entire book of all the prophets that is successful in delivering a prophecy and changing the people's minds.
Jonah?
Jonah. Mm-hmm. And the people who listened to him weren't even Jews.
And he clearly didn't care about the message, didn't want to deliver it, and did the least amount of things so he could officially say to
Right.
God, I did my job.
Jonah-
but he clearly
Right.
was not trying to prophesy at all.
So Jonah was like the Charlie Chaplin of the prophets. I mean, it's like really he's watching a silent movie because he only says 6 words in the entire book. Everything else just kind of happens. You can imagine like a piano playing and him flopping around inside of a fish and then going, and then he says, repent, and then everyone goes crazy and repents, right? So you could see that happening. By the way, it's great comic relief on Yom Kippur afternoon, right? To have a silent movie playing in the middle of holiday. But so here's the ultimate question, right? If the man of God who comes to prophesize these 3 great truths to a community, and there are more chapters devoted to prophets than any other section of the Tanakh, what is this God that we're talking about? It seems like this God is a failure. It seems like the God can't actually affect what God wants in the world, and that there isn't a prophet who is a successful religious person, a successful religious leader. They're all failures. If you read from the beginning of the 2nd book of Kings to the end of the prophetic section, it is about a community in decline, and it is about a political power in decline, and you have all of these men, forgive me, but mostly men, screaming at the top of their lungs to get people to change course, and they never change course, and they're destroyed. Why would you build a religion around that? Like, what is the efficacy of a God, of knowing a God through the prophetic language, if ultimately it leads to exile and destruction?
Well, there's
Sorry, small question, but you have 2 PhDs, and I, thought maybe you'd be able to answer it.
So, thanks for there are so many parts to that question. So if I end up gravitating toward one that wasn't your interest, redirect me or whatever. So I think number one, one of the things I heard was, about how to get people to change, how to get societies and communities to change. And God had already made a decision long before, at least from reading, if you were to read the Tanakh from beginning to end in a linear fashion, even though we know that not everything was written in that order, it was assembled later, right? But the way it is depicted is God had long ago given up the idea that we are puppets and God would control our actions, or let us play a little bit but step in like an overly protective parent to make sure that we behave well in the sandbox with the other kids. And what you tend to see through the Tanakh is the disappearing face of God. So much so that when you get to one of the last written pieces of the Book of Esther, there is no mention of God whatsoever, and the rabbis have to struggle to find some sort of veiled reference to a God somewhere in there, right? But clearly it's not about God, that book, at all. It's really about human beings now learning, even one woman from a slave family, finding her own courage and finding her within her own womanhood the wherewithal to stand up within herself as a woman and as a Jew, and as somebody who can be independently alive and vital to manage her corner of the world. And so what you end up having is a more effective model by the end of the Tanakh than you tend to do in the early stages of Tanakh, where people seem to be unruly, unmanageable children, and it takes a lot to become an adult. And this is carried on into the rabbinic tradition where when in the Tanur Shel Achnai story of the oven where they debate and God comes down and says that Rabbi Eliezer on this point is right, and they say, we don't listen to you anymore. Okay, we moved out a long time ago. We moved out of the house. We're living on our own. We have to make our own decisions. The depiction in the Talmud is that God is sitting in the rocking chair, smiling, saying, finally, my kids are growing up and they're not going to ask for me for more money and they're not going to hack me every mitvach and donnershtick. God spoke a lot of Yiddish in the Talmud.
Apparently in the prophets too.
In the prophets, yeah.
Forgive us, our Persian friends. That's
So the arc of is that God goes away as we mature so that we can learn to manage our own affairs, not only individually, but corporate affairs. That we have to manage our synagogue life, we have to manage our business life, we have to manage our school life, we have to manage our neighborhoods, but ultimately we're left to us to manage them. And the invention of halakha is a way to help us have a minimal level of a way of implementing our ethical ideals into a system of everyday living. So that is one piece of what I heard was God. And prophets who say they are God's mouthpiece on earth are like God. And so when prophets do that, even if they gave a compelling, rousing speech for the moment that got people riled up, as you correctly point out, it's really questionable how much lasting change they provided, and certainly by even in the best cases, the next generation, right? When you have a shofet who finally saves the people, 40 years later, by the next generation, anything that happened was already lost, right? So even in good situations, the people decline. But I think the point of whatever history is there or not there, I think what you have by the prophetic voice is giving us the inspiration to move forward. Because the reality is that in our lives, there is a lot of indecency and there is a lot of challenge to being authentic, and there is a lot of being ethical and being full of integrity is challenged by all kinds of voices that don't want us to do that, or that tell us it's stupid to do that, especially when no one else is doing that. And I think the inspiration of the prophets, to whatever they inspired the original audience, became rightly the focus, and the God of that voice became the focus of the Tanakh, the core of the Tanakh, and is what we're supposed to leave Shul with, not the Torah, but the Haftorah that follows it, if we are paying attention, because that is what not only gives us hope, but really gets us to think about what's important in life, what really matters, what makes life worth living. Truthfully, the other stuff doesn't. That's all small stuff in the scheme of being able to look at yourself in the mirror, or to say, this is the legacy I'm leaving my children or the next
So here's
generation.
where I'm going to disagree with you, because I think,
for it.
yeah, because I think that Amos, his voice was very contextual. It's the same way on Yom Kippur, right? We listen to Isaiah, the Haftarah of Isaiah. Is this the fast that I desire? No, I don't desire this fast. I want you to break the fetters of wickedness by feeding the poor, clothing the naked. Only then will the light break through as the dawn of the day, and you will be free. And that's what Isaiah wants. That's what Isaiah's God wants from us.
Right.
Right. But that's only in context of a service which begins with Pesukei de Zimra, and then the morning service, and then the Torah service. And as soon as you put the Torah away, and after the Haftarah is over, you open up the Ark again, and you begin with the Avodah service, which is all about the priest, and the Musaf Amidah. Now, why do I say that? Is because I believe that these prophets understood that at the core of the religious sensibility should be this prophetic move of social justice, of care, of authenticity, of love. But I also think that getting to that centerpiece, you have to go through the wilderness, the trials and travails of mitzvot, and of Torah study, and of being part of a identity of the nation. He's so contextual, I think, that he's speaking to people who already readily identify themselves as the children of Israel, that the only way that you say, what I don't want from you is sacrifices, what I want from you is letting justice roll down like a mighty stream, that's only for people who understand what sacrifices are. You have to get to a certain context. It's sort of like the Oreo cookie, where in order to get to the creamy center, you have to get through the 2 chocolate wafers.
Well, even with, I don't fully agree with that.
That's why
actually.
we're going to disagree with it. That's why.
Okay. When I say I don't fully agree, I actually disagree. So I think that first of all, we actually don't do a voda where I daven for High Holy Days. That's not, doesn't speak to us. Which is why, the traditional avoda doesn't speak that the Harlo Machzor changed the avoda completely from what it was, and now the new conservative movement Machzor has sort of modified from that. But I think that when you put the Torah service was originally the last thing done, and so when you left Shul, you were left with the inspiration of the Haftarah. Maybe you did a Leno or something, but basically the other prayers were done before the Torah reading. Number one. Number two is that he's saying, what are you doing in Shul? Right? That's what the prophets are saying. For Amos, at best, does not even care about sacrifices bichlal, if you do them at all. There is no evidence. I know that it's popular to say that, when the prophets say, don't bother with a sacrifice, do good deeds, the popular interpretation by rabbis and synagogues is what they mean is it's not good to do sacrifices if you don't do good deeds as well. But there's no evidence in Amos that he wants you to even do sacrifices. There's too many other good things, important things to be doing in the world. Why would you waste your time doing a sacrifice? Is basically Amos's position, and it is the position of some of the other prophets.
But he would also say you shouldn't be playing golf on Saturday morning.
Shouldn't be what? I didn't hear.
Playing golf on Saturday morning, or you shouldn't
Yeah,
be going.
he
He is like Peter Singer, right? Who is He is an ethicist that says that any luxury good that you have is ethically abominable.
But he
And that what
doesn't-
you should do is you should sell your Mercedes and you should sell your Lexus and buy the cheapest car you can and give your money away to the poor.
Right.
That is Amos's position.
But Amos, I think, thinks that maybe going to Sheol and offering sacrifices is worse because
Then playing golf on Saturday morning
Yes,
in a
I
club that
think-
you spend money
yes,
on,
I
and
actually think-
don't pay the guy who lifts your golf club property.
Yes, and I'm only giving Amos.
That's
I'm the
amazing.
messenger. Please remember the difference between the messenger and the message. I want to go home tonight.
You know your Bible. You know what happens to the messengers in the Bible.
Yeah, I'm not saying Ko Amar Hashem. I think that he feels that it's worse when you pretend that being a good Jew and a pious person consists of how many times you rock back and forth when you shuckle when you do the Amidah. I think he thinks that kind of posturing for piety is obnoxious to Amos, and that he would rather people don't go to shul at all. And while he's not necessarily saying doing golf is right, when there's so many things in the world that you could be spending time trying to help out by volunteering to help out with poor people or whatever it is, but I think he's particularly disgusted at public displays of piety that are not backed up by even a modicum of helping people in need.
There, you and I think totally agree, is that empty piety is pretty useless, and that knowing God only through ritual is pretty chauvinistic in many ways.
And I would like to then say that we must admit, I am from the conservative movement, and I grew up in the conservative movement. I went to Camp Ramah. I was part of my youth chorale, blah, blah, blah. I have to say that the conservative movement has to at least plead to some guiltiness for caring more about punctiliousness about halakha concerns and about quality of davening, and has been late in the game to really take up social justice and social concerns. Social justice in previous generations in conservative synagogues was having an Israel Bonds drive on the High Holy Days, and that's not even tzedakah. I mean, Israel Bonds. That's investing your own money in a way, right? So I think
Right, but I will also say that at the latest biennial, Rick Jacobs, who is the head of the Reform movement, says social justice can't maintain a movement on its own. It needs tradition, history, study, and tefillah as a way of maintaining Jewish identity.
And Amos would reply, that may or may not be true, but the danger that we face is not a community that is so overly involved in making a better world and doing tikkun olam that we should tell people to restrain themselves somewhat in case they get overly involved in making a better world. God forbid they'll be too successful and have nothing to do. But meanwhile, I think his concern is that too many people who are pious Jews spend too much time worried about their correctness of halachic punctiliousness and are not doing social justice hardly at all. And that the balance for him is like this. And he'd like to get the social justice part at least even. And I think that, and I actually think that he's right. I think that I don't know that I cannot say that there are too many Jews involved in helping poor people or doing social justice. I don't feel we're anywhere close to that in the conservative movement or in the world. And it is true that we have a lot of other things on our plate. The anti-Semitism is horrible, and we need to make sure of the safety of our fellow Jews in Europe, and we need to be concerned about Israel's survival. I'm not disagreeing with those kinds of things, but we cannot let survival needs of some Jews trump living in a value-driven way. And I think the values of the prophets are inspirational guides, their words, for us to try to do that.
Look, I agree with you. I don't think there's anyone else in this room who's probably done more for social justice through a Jewish context than I have in this room. And so I totally agree with you.
I was looking at you only because you asked the question. I was not
No.
looking at you to accuse you of
No,
anything.
I don't feel accused. I don't feel accused, but I do feel credentialed to say, since I have a pretty big social justice bona fides, that I also feel that while you might be right about looking over our shoulder to the right side of our community and saying there are too many Jews who care too much about the color of their tefillin, and they don't do enough to take care of the poor, if you look over to the left, you find people who are also not involved in Jewish life and are marginally involved in doing social justice, and their core Jewish identity, their authentic faith and personal integrity, which are the two other parts of Amos's prophecy, is also severely lacking. And what we know
Well, I think
is that
authentic
Jewish
faith-
behavioralism, that is to say, rituals, Torah study, Chag, fasting, feasting, building a sukkah, lighting Chanukiah, and doing it with the kind of integrity, the kind of authenticity, and the punctiliousness that comes with good training and discipline, create a core Jewish behavioral identity in which then doing social justice can have a natural context. And so that is where I think you and I might be a little separate, but when I'm looking at, if I was thinking Amos came today, I think he would change his message a little bit, because I don't know if he could imagine a world with such a fractured Jewish identity and a fractured Jewish mission as we have today.
Well, I don't know. I think that might not necessarily. I think that, but I don't want to challenge historical analogies or anything, but I will say that most of us, we can't talk to the people who don't come into our doors. So the people who are so unaffiliated, who might be doing too much social justice and not enough anything else, or are so committed but aren't having an authentic faith, I don't always have the chance to talk to them. We tend to have more opportunities to talk to people who are already in the door and rather committed. And on the balance of those, part of their authentic Jewish faith, or at least they're living a godly life, has to be also doing things that help other people, and without even defining what those might be, right? There are lots of need out there. So that's number one. Number two is that it would be nice if we could get the Jews who are involved in social justice to have dialogue with those Jews who are, for whom Jewish traditions and heritage speak to them in a very clear way. I know of an attempt to bring different communities together for this recent Simchat Torah, and I actually even had a congregant who would not go because one of the communities joining was a Reform community and felt that they couldn't do Simchat Torah with Reform Jews. I know that when I was in a conservative community in another place, and the Orthodox place down the block was actually a converted house, but it was up and there were many steps. I worked very hard because it was a mostly senior population, and in the east there's a lot of snow and ice, and to give them a room in the synagogue where no one would have to walk up a hill of steps of ice and snow, and they, with their own prayer books, their own chumashim, blah, 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 and they refused to do it because they said it's not kosher to use the bathroom of a conservative shul. So I think part of the problem we have is that the people who love Jewish traditions and try to live them in a joyful way, and that is an emphasis for them, don't always actually like to talk to Jews for whom social justice is an emphasis and for whom traditions don't actually resonate so well.
And the opposite is true too.
Yeah, I think they don't talk to each other,
Right.
is what I'm saying. And I think what an enriching conversation it could be to get Jews who live different kinds of Jewish life with Jewish emphases together to talk about who they are as Jews and how they perceive themselves and live. When you get into a synagogue family, you tend to have people who at least in some way are homogeneous, right? They tend to have gathered into a reform or a particular kind of reform or a particular kind of conservative or a particular kind of Orthodox shul because they are like-minded, whatever that like-mindedness focuses on. And we don't really have enough opportunities to study together, daven together, talk together, do social action together, et cetera, et cetera. When we have mitzvah days, they're often synagogue-driven
Right.
and not.
So I agree with all that, although I will tell you that one version of maximum inclusivity includes making sure that all the food is hechshered kosher, that you don't do certain activities on Shabbat, that you do certain things in order for those people who need those as restrictions, as part of the things that do resonate with them, feel comfortable in the community. And there are plenty of, Reform Jews, other types of Jews who are not in that mode, that don't take that into consideration, and therefore even the Jews who are more open to speaking with less observant Jews don't feel comfortable because they don't feel welcomed in those places.
I think one of the kinds of experiments that have been going on, but that could be possible ways to help create a better thing for the next generation are pluralistic community schools and day schools. So I teach at one, and I'm in a community where we have Orthodox to secular Jewish families in one school. They all chose to come to a Jewish school. Clearly not necessarily all for the same necessarily motivation of the parent, but they're all together. And we have the opportunity and hopefully some success in getting, trying to create experiences where the adjective that describes their Jewishness matters less, and that they find ways to communicate around Jewishness so that they can create a different kind of community where
Sure.
all of that is possible. And in our pluralistic community, clearly Jewish traditions matter, as well as personal integrity of every person, as well as doing social justice. In fact, we hardly have a club that is not some sort of a poverty awareness club is now doing something with Hand in Hand, which is a different kind of club to do something in response to the Paris bombings. All student driven and student led. Everything we do, almost all those clubs are student led. The assembly on Friday is from the Cake Club, creating a kihila of equality, creating a community of equality. And this week is Anti-Bullying Week, and Friday is Stand-Up to Bullying Day, International Stand-Up Bullying Day, and it's also Transgender Day of Remembrance. And so they are running, those students, a assembly, and they've been doing stuff all week to get the school ready for their assembly.
So I think though, going back to the Tanakh for a minute, the prophetic voice is really important. I do think that. And I think that there's multiple voices in the prophets too, right? So like you've got Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah, the sort of a proto-prophet almost, his whole way of looking at prophecy was to re-enliven faith. He actually, he worked with a widow who was about to die, but he didn't see that as an injustice that had to be fixed on a system-wide basis. It was somebody who was calling out to him that needed help, and he helped them. But his mission was to bring Elohim Chaim back to the people. And Amos, I think, is a corollary to Elijah in that way, because he took that and turned it into this social justice piece. Amos' student, Hosea, he wasn't as focused on social justice as he was into fidelity of the covenant. And his whole life, both physically and in terms of the allegory of his life, were about the fidelity between a man and a woman, or between a husband and wife, and that was the symbol of the love between God and the people and the fidelity of the covenant, which had as much to do with mitzvot as it did with care and concern for those who live at the margin. So there are lots of voices in the prophets. I know you chose Amos, and that's why I was sort of picking on him a little bit. But what makes the Tanakh is that there's a chorus of voices.
There is no more exacting voice on social justice than Amos from beginning to end, right?
Right.
Though most other prophets don't ignore social justice, there's none as exacting as him. What I would say, a number of things in response to what you laid out. It is, Elijah and Elisha are really shamanistic, and they're actually not considered classical prophets. When you speak of the classical prophets, you really start talking about the Hosea onward in time. The kind of, of work that Elijah did was definitely had strong elements of emphasis on authentic faith, and as well as doing shamanistic rituals of healing and things like that. But he also was not without his social justice in Naboth's vineyard, etc., of being very exacting on when Jezebel coerced her husband, King
Right.
Ahab, to take over somebody else's land for no reason at all other than she wanted it, right? So there is social justice in there as well. I think that it's hard for anyone, I'm surprised Amos could do it, but it's hard for anyone to live a life that constantly exemplifies an ideal of making the world into a world that represents what God wants, that sort of, if a God is a God of peace, and we call God Shalom, then the world should reflect that, and it doesn't. But it's hard to do that because, we need to give time. Many of us feel like we want to give at least equal time to family, and some of us actually need to earn a living so that we can actually feed our family. And when you start getting involved in the things of life, to tell people like Amos does, you're not, get out there and do social justice. We got to prepare the world. It's actually hard to do that as your main focus. And there are special people who work among the poor, like a Mother Teresa, or who run a nonprofit organization that's designed, clearly to help out, and the head of the ADL or other kinds of organizations that are, whether they're Jewish oriented or general in a society or for a specific cause, but those people are few and far between, and so it may be that the Amos needs to be the anomaly, but yet I think that I grew up in a household where rituals, we were rich in rituals, and Shabbat and Kashrut and holiday traditions. I wasn't really, Jewish living wasn't anything that was really foreign to me. And yet, my mother would schlep me to a protest rally and to do things that would signify our concern for other people. We even got arrested together once. We were let go and whatever, and it was arranged by our rabbi ahead of time because in that case it was for Soviet Jews, part of the struggle for Soviet Jews in the 60s. My parents were very big on integrity kinds of messages of, you don't have to lie, but you don't always have to tell the truth either, right? You got to tell the truth when it's a reason to tell it, and you got to do it in a nice way and whatever. So there are a lot of things that I grew up with that all three of the messages of the prophets that I tried to present tonight sort of cohered for me and spoke to me. But I do, but part of me personally came back into, I felt more spiritual And I felt that my traditions resonated when social justice came alive for me. I appreciated the traditions personally, and it's fun to have Shabbat guests over, and it builds good relationships in community. And I could maybe see how there's some connection, but I never felt as spiritual as when I started doing the work of helping other people. There actually is something that is personally can be very deepening when you are selflessly helping somebody else, not for a thank you, not for a reward, but just because that is part of who we are as people. And part of being a mensch isn't just saying thank you and saying please, but part of being a mensch has to be a person who cares about other people. I don't think I call a mensch somebody who's just a non-criminal and who davens. I think to be a mensch, you actually have to be a caring person whose caring is exhibited in real action.
See, I would say it a little differently, because you and I think, really are actually very close on this, but I would say it a little differently. I would say that in addition to feeling really spiritually uplifted personally when I do chesed or tzedek in the world, because I do, and I think it's great and wonderful, but I feel even more spiritually and personally uplifted when I do those things, knowing that I am situating myself in an ancient flow of a people, of a nation, of a way of being in the world, when I see the world play out in front of me, and knowing that I am doing the words of chesed and tzedek and mishpat, and that I think God delights in those things, because I know that, because it says so in the Tanakh, that God delights in those who pursue God's justice. And I feel more uplifted because I know that than I do just because I'm a humanist. And that to me means that I need enough education, discipline, and learning under my belt to situate myself into that ancient flow.
I agree with all that, but it's not just that I feel good, I actually feel closer to God in a way that I can't otherwise. I feel close to God when I do an Amida and when I daven, so I'm not against prayer, and I don't think actually I necessarily feel closer to God when I'm trying to live a life of integrity, because that's something that needs to be somehow becoming part of your nature, that you sort of just do an act of kindness, but you're not thinking, oh, gee, maybe I can connect to God right now. But when I do social justice and helping others, and I try to make the world a better, more godly kind of world, I actually feel closer to God. And not in the same way, in a different way, that when I'm just davening my Amida or doing other kinds of things. I can feel close to God in those things, but in a different way. It's almost like I have a relationship with God that is acted out in my ritual life, but I am God's ambassador when I am out in the world with other people, and when I'm doing things to make that world a more godly place, and I'm doing it with the kind of consciousness and background that you're talking about, then I actually do feel I'm not just doing a good deed, or I'm just not making myself feel better, or I feel better not because I'm making myself. I actually just feel closer to God when I'm doing those kinds of actions.
Okay, we have time for maybe one question, because we have to, it's almost 9 o'clock. Bobby, I'll give you one question.
Okay. So I'm going to give you the Amos answer, and please don't confuse Amos with the Dr. Sachs, that other guy. Okay? So Gewalt Jews, Amos clearly spoke Yiddish. Gewalt Jews, don't despair. There's too much work to be done. And getting despair is actually giving more opportunity for despair to happen around you when you can actually do things to remove despair. And what you need to be doing is figuring out ways that you can make this better. If there may be Muslims who are committing acts of terror, but when did you invite a local Muslim community in dialogue with you? When did you do a Thanksgiving service with Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews? We're all Americans. And if we can start building relationships with other people, that itself will be empowering. And it will empower them actually to realize much more about who their neighbors are. That we're not just Americans, but we're Jewish Americans and Protestant Americans and Catholic Americans and Buddhist Americans. And I think that when you don't talk to people because some of their fellow co-religionists act out, that we're not really doing the right move. And I think there's been too little dialogue among people who assume goodwill but don't build relationships. And I think that rather than despairing, we have too many work to do by finding partners, Jewish partners, Christian partners, atheist partners, Muslim partners, all kinds of partners, to not so that we don't despair, but so we can do things to actually make life better for more people. And taking time for despair is really, can be a pity party. And I think that Amos would be really horrified that it's different to take time to mourn the victims, that's one thing, and to go to the funeral and to support the families. That clearly is an act of chesed that should be done. But if we're going to sit around despair for weeks and months on end, we are wasting time that can be better spent building a better world. You're welcome.
We're going to have to wrap. I see we come up here and ask questions after, but I want to thank Dr. Sachs for coming tonight.
My pleasure.
Thank you. It's good to have you here. We'll see you in 2 weeks back here when Rabbi Feinstein will be addressing the community on the occasion of Rabbi Schulweiss's yard site. So we'll see you then.